Reverend Dr. Jaime Romo, please. Thank you so much for coming, and I let you take over the computer here.
Thanks, Gordon.
Welcome.
And thanks for those who are here and those who are watching. As Gordon mentioned, this is the third of the series, and the first was the basic question, who are we? And the basic answer for that is, my core answer is, we're not just human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience, which is a radical shift in how we think of ourselves and other people. And the next big question was, what do we want? And bottom line is, we want to be happy, we want to be whole. And so we talked about what gets in the way of that. So the mechanics of trauma and how life experiences impact us and impact our mental health, our physical health, and even our sense of self, our meaning, our spiritual self. And so today is focused on what's our purpose, which is essentially about helping one another, with the idea that we're in a context of worldwide and certainly national survival issues about racism, about environmental justice, about economic justice, just so many ways that we are killing one another and are disconnected from ourselves. And so I'm going to focus a bit today on that piece, given the recent events in the Capitol, January 6th, the more widespread attention to the way race plays out, white supremacy in particular, and how that impacts everyone and what we can do about that. So to answer that first, the third question, what's my purpose? I love Thich Nhat Hanh's response in the sense that we're all connected, and each of us has a kind of a mirror set of information for us, that we can see our faults and our strengths in one another. And so he says, you are me and I am you. Isn't it obvious that we inter-are? You cultivate the flower in yourself so that I will be beautiful. I transform the garbage in myself so that you will not have to suffer. And I know that's a central part of my work as a hospice chaplain, trying to be as present as possible, transforming my own life experience and trauma and experiences that get in the way of being my best self, so that I can be present to others and not project anxiety, not project fear, not project whatever reaction to others. And at the same time, finding, when we see something we really like in others, it's really something in ourselves that we are seeing, but not so much clearly in ourselves. And this idea of what's my purpose, this George Eliot quote, is we're basically here to make life less difficult for each other. We're interconnected. We're basically here to help one another. So, some basic ideas is that everybody has privilege, everybody has bias, everybody has trauma of some sort. And there's no shame in that. The shame is not recognizing it and working with it so that it becomes useful for us, so it becomes a resource for us and others. And so the picture of Gandhi is, he's on money. Gandhi had privilege. He's a well-educated kind of elite class in Hinduism, and kind of was shocked when he was thrown off the train in South Africa because he was not being treated as he saw himself. And in his journey, we'll talk a little bit about that later, he integrated and became a resource for others. Everybody's got some kind of trauma that keeps us from being connected more deeply to ourselves, and in that way to be connected with others. And then this piece, racism. Bias with power is this racism, or this ism. And we'll talk more specifically about that going forward. As we just say, here's some simple rules. And in all of this, I'll say, I'm going to present a few models, and there's an expression that all models are wrong, some are useful. And so I hope these will be useful. But the idea of treat racism like COVID, right? We believe that it's real. We've got a lot of people maybe who still might deny that it's real. Learn more about it from experts. assume that we can be carriers, even if we don't think have the symptoms. And then we do everything we can to eradicate it. And so we're all in this soup of colonialism, soup of a kind of supremacy, white supremacy, that impacts everyone. It's a detriment to everyone. And so here's one model. This pyramid that the most extreme expressions of white supremacy can be, killing others, violence, lynching, hate crimes. And those are not isolated. They're connected to bystanders. They're connected to cheerleaders, in part. They're connected to bystanders who may feel guilty, or other bystanders who may be oblivious, and to people who may think, it doesn't affect me, so it's not really something that I should get caught up with. The reality is that, again, everybody's got privilege, everybody's got trauma, everybody's got bias. This particular kind of privilege, call it, has some real damage to everyone. I'll just say privilege in general, if you think of the spikes like going into a garage, privilege is, think of it as the spikes lay down. They're going in the same direction that you're going in. Right? Being on the other side of that is when you know that there's something in place that is not helping you, that could damage you. And so a lot of people might think, I'm really not an active participant in this kind of system of privilege. Beverly Daniel Tatum has this image of a moving sidewalk. The idea that we may stand on it and say, I'm not an active participant, but we're still benefiting. Right? Granted, some people like running down the sidewalk. Some people might be like keeping other people off that moving sidewalk. Again, models are limited. But there's this flip side of that kind of privilege. And in particular, call it white privilege. Males, there's a 3.7 higher rate of suicide than females. And it may be that, males take more direct action, females indirect, more attempts by females. But there's this idea that there's something odd about that. White males in particular have twice as many suicides as men of color. There's something strange about that speaks to disconnect. And this other piece that says, how do we use our privilege? Ibram Kendi has a book called Stamped from the Beginning. And he has this model basically to say, we're either promoting in some way racism or we're anti-racist. The overt segregationists, the overt people who want to take back, days of slavery and that kind of power, that's overt. Then the covert, he calls those segregationists. The covert he calls them assimilationists. And it's basically a lot of what happens. It's a lighter version. We're not changing the system. We may have nice actions individually, but still benefit and still allow others to have the disadvantage of the systems in place. And so our hope is that we're all in that working to be anti-racist, all working to be more whole. And that we can use that in a way that's helpful. I'm going to be directing a conference, and maybe we can put it online. But it's to study groups, to study the collective unconscious, to study why are we in the place that we are. And the title is Activism as a Spiritual Practice. And I think that's significant because we've done a lot of activism in ways that continue to maybe make incremental changes, or maybe ways that even cancel out others' good efforts. So here's an anti-racist example. Are you familiar with Jane Elliott? 1968, this teacher in Rice, Iowa, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, in this very homogenous community where people were saying, good, she wanted to interrupt that with the kids because they're so impressionable. And so she had this experiment where in one day she would privilege the kids with blue eyes, and the next day she would flip and privilege the kids with brown eyes. And it was really dramatic. One day, whoever was in that group got more recess time. They got more positive comments. They got to go back for seconds at lunch. Little things. And then when that flipped, that same group the next day did worse on their spelling tests. They got into fights. They looked dejected. And so she set up this dynamic where there's an up group and a down group, and gave more praise, gave more recognition, and saw the academic success. And for teachers, we know that one of the big indicators for student success is teacher expectations, and how we see ourselves in those people, how we connect with those, how we reach out and provide resources. So I would just say, does this, those kids who were praised were the up group and they did better? Those who were not praised, those who were blamed, who were told that they weren't as good or weren't as smart and so on, they internalized all that. And this is what I was meaning by this supremacy idea of whatever group is toxic for everyone, because then we internalize it and start to believe that maybe there's something wrong with us, something less than, and that has some consequences. So who are the up groups in society? I would just say, in general, pardon? White men, heterosexual men, people with some money, resources, people with, pardon? Education, definitely. People have good social skills, maybe. People have some taller people even. Yeah, there are these subtle ways that, some people are seen as the leaders, as the ones who have the right answer and so on. And the down group tend to be people with less resources, fewer resources. People have more physical issues, maybe because of the environment, maybe because of the lack of resources and so on. Fewer education, fewer networking opportunities and so on. And there's this thing called correspondence theory in sociology. I'm going to speed up. The idea of that somehow we get the outcome that somehow we want, even if we don't want to admit that. And so here are a few quick examples of things that we get outcomes even if we don't want to acknowledge that. And so when, in the past in particular, white men is seen as the norm and the ones who count, that's where research has gone. That's where resources have gone. Those who have had voting rights or land ownership. And so as a response then, there's a civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter movement to say, actually, everybody should be entitled. Everybody should have these type of privileges. A good program like the GI Bill, after World War II, it was a great idea, but still there were redlining practices that kept resources given to some and not to others. Or housing in some areas for some and not others. And it's maybe an older but a long-standing practice about certain groups don't have the same brain size. They're not as intelligent, and so they shouldn't be in certain schools. And that actually has been internalized. That's, if you think of historically black colleges and universities, there's some that were the trade schools that were darker skinned people, and others that were the more kind of professional schools that were lighter skinned. And so this is, again, we've all internalized toxic stuff. The idea of heterosexism, the suicide rate, the violence towards LGBTQ people, it speaks for itself. And this is old, but Kenneth Clark, after right before Brown versus Board of Education, made the point that even little kids, when they're looking at dolls, would choose the white doll as the pretty one, as the smart one, as the good one, and so on. And this is an old example, but something that's ongoing. And there's a lot more literature coming from various groups who talk about that we've all internalized this kind of belief system. So how do we get to this anti-racist place? I mean, it's not a quick fix. How do we integrate the desire to change society as well as the desire to transform our own stuff that we're carrying around? And so I love these quotes. Love without action is meaningless, and action without love is irrelevant. And activism without spirituality is just an angry mob. So how do we really do our work, whatever that work is, interpersonally as well as in society, in a way that's more transformative? Okay, so here's where the models are wrong, but hopefully they're useful. You know, some of these, in dominant culture, and we can think of stages where people can, say, go from unconscious incompetency about privileges, about systemic bias, and so on, and how we benefit. And then we can become consciously incompetent, uncomfortable with knowing that this is going on and it's not fair, but not really knowing how we can be different. And then with some practice, a lot of practice, we can become more consciously competent and be a partner, be someone who is helpful in undoing that kind of system or those types of power relationships. And then we go in forward to maybe individually, not even really thinking about it, having a dual consciousness. Another way of thinking about it is that when we start with awareness and then we go to sensitivity. You know, how does this mean? What does this mean to me? What do I need to do? And we start to do those things in private transformation, and then transformation, you know, it shows up in how we work and live. And another version is that, you know, we can, you know, the idea of the museum of tolerance. I mean, actually, tolerance is the lowest level of getting along. Right? But then we can accept people. That's better. Right? And then we can really live with respect and work with respect, but really doing with solidarity. And I think that's where the anti-racism work happens, but that's based on respect. So we've got to be way far from tolerance and acceptance. And this other idea of like beginning, that's more of an educational model, you know, kind of like the top one, unconsciously incompetent. We're just kind of clumsy at it, and then we're practicing, and then apprentice, like, well, we're doing okay. I'll just, for a group that might be considered a minority group, although we're moving towards minority majority, right? But this is the idea that, and this comes from the work of Jerry Teo years ago. I really like this. It's a very simple model, too simple, in fact, because there's a lot of more complexity and identity. But the idea that initially, if we're surrounded by people who support us, who, you know, we share language, we share ways of working together, we're included and all that, we have that I'm okay, you're okay kind of simple way of living. For some, it's a dramatic thing to go to school and to have a different culture, a different style, a different food, any number of things where people might change their name from Francisco to Frank, right? Or to, you know, and we learn, but there's that's the assimilation part, and that's the internalization part also. Is like, well, where I came from is not really what is desired and what is good. And then at some point we realize that doesn't work. There's something that deep in us that is disconnected, and there may be a rage to it, and that we flip, and from that I'm okay, but you're not okay, right? And so we may want to tear down systems. We may want to blast people who represent things that were oppressive colonialism, whether it is present or past. It's not fair. It's not nice. It's part of this development process to where we get to a place where we know that we're all part okay and we're all human and imperfect. And so we think of Gandhi. You know? So he had that rude awakening where he was thrown off the train, where he became an advocate, and he then had to shift from just keeping things the way things were to a radical challenge to the larger system. And he's very ethnocentric when he's doing that. Right? But he came from a very spiritual place. Think of Malcolm. I mean, there was a time where he was, they called him Red because he was dyeing his hair because he was trying to fit in. And then went through his militant, call it phase, where he said basically white people are children of Satan and all that, and he's like really awful. And then he went to Mecca and he saw people fairer skinned who he said were better Muslims, and he started to realize that no, that wasn't good enough. You know? And that was when he was killed. He was killed by people in that third stage when he was kind of moving beyond that and being more inclusive and recognizing his own damage that he had been doing. And this goes on, right? So to be real brief, there's a shift, from this, we're just seeing black and white historically or metaphorically, to seeing the interconnectedness, to seeing that we're all part and we all suffer or we all gain from the environment around us. Trauma-informed, I think, is good for everyone, whether it's about racial issues or economic issues. The people need to be safe. People need to know that they can trust others. People need to be able to bring their voice and collaborate and navigate the systems. People basically need to be empowered. That's the healing direction we need to go in. And so for some, the work is that internal healing from what's happened to us. And for some, the work is untangling the privilege that we've been oblivious to, so that we have that safety within ourselves, where we can welcome support, where we can regulate, we can manage our emotions, where we have good boundaries. I think a lot of the ways that we see societal trauma is like extreme reactions to things, or not any reaction to things, letting things go. And so having boundaries means that, we recognize when something is out of line and we address it. Recognizing triggers, not just individually, but again, societally. What is going on with the fear, this acting out of the lizard brain? We talked about that in the last presentation, where our brain kind of goes offline, and we're into this reaction mode. Oh, that other piece, to be able to say, I hate nothing about you, that's very aspirational. Even to say when people have done great harm. I know Martin Luther King, I know Gandhi, I know very spiritual leaders have had that stance, have been able to come out of that place of love, even when great damage and harm has been done to them and those around them. And so this is the beginning of a conversation where, to answer the questions again, who are we? Well, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And that calls us to continue to integrate, to continue to recognize this human experience is messy and painful and a process. And we all have bias. We all have some kind of privilege. And that we're here to help one another. And so there's this beautiful poem. Mark Nepo, I just saw this the other day. I don't know who this person is. He says, my soul tells me we were all broken from the same nameless heart, and every living thing wakes with a piece of that original heart aching its way into blossom. That's why we know each other below our strangeness, why when we fall, we lift each other, or when we are in pain, we hold each other. Why when sudden with joy, we dance together. Life is the many pieces of that great heart loving itself back together. And so that's kind of the challenge, right? But to recognize who we are, that we all want this wholeness, that we're doing the best we can, even though that may not be real great at times, knowing that that's part of the progress, part of the process, and that we can allow ourselves and others to grow, and at the same time deal with this larger history that has gone on for so long, whatever kinds of supremacy, that has colonized countries and colonized minds, and caused such harm to people that they would want to disconnect, that they see no way to get beyond their pain or isolation or fear. So I'll stop there and just open this up, I guess, for part 2, which is going to require a little bit of furniture moving. And we'll have a conversation.
So here we are. Dr. Jaime Romo just did the presentation, the third part of the 3-part series. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much for that. we have an audience, so I thank you all for joining us also, small audience.
We're going to do some question asking and maybe bring the audience in and see if they have any questions. But I have a really big question. Well, I don't know if it's a big question, but I have a question for you. I really like how, or you know what, before I ask my question, would you mind summarizing part 1, part 2, and then what you just did so that some of the people that didn't see the first 2 can kind of have an idea where we are?
Sure. So part 1, the big question is, who am I? Who are we? And my focus was, we're not just human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience. That's Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic theologian from the 60s. Then part 2 is, what do I want? And we want to be whole, we want to be happy, and so on, but there's a lot of that human experience that gets in the way, trauma, things that lead to our own self-disconnect and self-destruction. And there's a lot of study around that with the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, that points to the physical illness, consequences of unresolved trauma, and then there are other mental and spiritual consequences. And then this last one is then, so what's our purpose? And so my stance on that is that we are here to help one another. You know, we are connected to one another. And so one of the many ways that's really obvious that we're struggling with is not just white supremacy, but just overall the disconnects, any kinds of supremacies. But we talked a little bit about racial identity development and some of the dynamics around that race piece in our society.
Yeah. I love how you included race and racism and how, what kind of a role, I mean, we're talking about what is our purpose, and if somebody just saw that title alone, and maybe even saw the first 2 episodes, and then saw the title of the next episode, maybe wouldn't have thought that racism would have been such a big part of the presentation and such a huge impact on our lives as human beings. So I love that. I was wondering if you could maybe explain more that connection between our individual growth and healing, our growth and healing as a species, I guess you could say, or as just mankind as a whole, and how racism came into play, and why is that such a huge part of all of that?
That is a big question. I mean, the whole
right from the beginning.
Racism piece, I do like Kendi's description that there have been different ways that people have used and oppressed others, conquered others.
Yeah.
But this piece about whiteness as the superior group really became like just a reinforced component of conquering, of starting a new beginning. And so he really traces that in his book to this country with slavery, and then the impacts and the ways that it's been formally supported through religion, through church, through, of course, through laws, and then practice. And I would just say that there's an expression, I don't know who discovered water, but I don't think it was a fish. So there are like more people who are speaking up now who are saying this water is contaminated, right? And it's not good for us. And I think there are more and more people who are understanding trauma to understand that it's not just a single event. It could be generational. It could be, the impacts could be developmental over time. And as that's reinforced in society in different ways, there's measurable impact. So we first learned about PTSD with war veterans, and then we realized, women in particular with domestic violence have the same kind of symptoms. Right? So what is it that's happening to us? What's it happening around us? What is it that we're doing? And then ultimately, what do we internalize and do to ourselves that leads to our own physical and mental health issues? So we're continuing to learn that we're all connected and we impact each other. And unfortunately, I know from my own experience, as hard as we try to do well, to be good, if we haven't acknowledged and integrated the parts of us that have done harm to ourselves or others, then those are going to show up again and get in the way.
Yeah. So it sounds like racism has been a tool for one to gain power over another. So, and like you said, conquering, when you're talking about countries, nations, you even just racial groups, I guess you could say, and based on skin color and things like that at some point. It just seems like it's too easy to see that, and that's all we show each other is this negativity, this racism. It's easy to see what's at the top of that pyramid, right? You know, the genocide, the violence, and things like that. But I think some of what we need to really work on, I think, is the bottom of the pyramid, where we don't necessarily, like you said, we're all privileged, we're all prejudiced, we're all, to some degree or another, it's not just on or off, it's not just black and white. I guess what are some of the steps that we can take to realize what we have and what kind of an impact that it makes on others, even though it might be subtle, and sometimes we don't even recognize it in ourselves maybe. What are like real things that people can do? I know you said treat it like COVID, and I love that. You know, I love that idea, because I mean, I got my mask right here, right? And so if I don't accept that it's real, how do we heal, right? And how do we get to that point maybe?
Yeah, I mean, for some, the healing process is when we hit rock bottom, or there's something bad happens that doesn't go our way, and it makes us to rethink. I mean, in part, just thinking about the statistics of suicide, the statistics of violence and all kinds of misery. I mean, going back to basics, you know, recognize what was happening to us, to our physical health, recognize what's happening around us with our kind of social, societal health. So that's, I guess, part one for anybody, is just to pay attention. I mean, it's a kind of a Buddhist summary of everything is connected, everything changes, pay attention. So part one is just pay attention, you know? And know that we can easily disconnect from things that are unpleasant. We can dysregulate, we can dissociate. And there's a coping mechanism to that. So all this, again, can we slow down in the context of layers and layers of ongoing shock and upset? And so individually, we can do that, you know, for one another. Ideally, you know, churches or schools or you know, public organizations would be safe, would be places where people can trust the authorities. They would have voice and sense of choice and empowerment and so on. That's what we could hope for and to build. And even that is challenging. You know, what curriculum, how do we open up spaces where people can actually bring experiences in a safe way to get support. So this is, you know, we start with ourselves. There's a great podcast by Valerie Kaur called Revolutionary Love. And she's a civil rights activist and lawyer, and someone she called her uncle was the first Sikh religious person who was killed after 9/11. And she talks about her process of needing to come to a place of loving, not forgetting what the murderer did, but to having a conversation with him and to letting go of that. And there's a similar one with, you know, Tariq Kamisa, I think. His son was a USD student years ago delivering pizza, and his 14-year-old killed him, you know, looking for, you know, quick money. And that father is reconciled, has been a mentor actually for the person now who is his son's murderer. So we'd have to do, not everybody's ready to have that kind of radical love. And maybe we have moments of it. And again, that's where the starting point is, I think.
Yeah, I feel like just in my interaction with others, it seems like some people just don't recognize it maybe, or maybe that's just what they're saying, you know, who knows? And some people recognize it, and like you say, maybe they're not ready to heal. And others are actively working towards getting better and understanding that they need to fix themselves before their surroundings can get better. But you touched on the suicide, right? As far as white males having a higher rate of suicide, it sounded like you said, right?
Than any other group, yeah.
So that kind of tells me that even though if we're talking about white supremacy being something where one group based on their lighter skin tone is oppressing another group based on their darker skin tone, why is it that that group is also, it sounds like it's hurting both sides, basically, I guess is what I'm saying. And so when does one realize that, I'm oppressing somebody and my demographic is dying or actually taking their own life, How does one get to the point where they realize that that needs to change? That just because you feel like you're above somebody doesn't mean that it's not hurting you too.
Yeah. I mean, so we all internalize this stuff, of superiority or inferiority and the rage or the fear that comes with that. There's plenty of data, and there's this expression for me of, too often we see what we believe rather than believe what we see. And if we just see the data, the carnage, the suffering, that should do something. But relationships have a huge part, I think, as a catalyst for people to notice and then be, aware, sensitive, and then take some responsibility, to be an ally or to be in solidarity with others. So I think that's hopeful. And there's this great timeline, we couldn't show it here. It's like 400 years of injustice, put together by some Sunni students, I think, a couple years ago. And it has all these moments of oppression, and certainly around race and sex and class and so on. But it has also significant times where people have worked to promote inclusion, equity. And there's a great show on Netflix called Amended? Talking about the 14th Amendment.
With Will Smith?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I started.
So there's some hope. It's just hard.
I think that's the key. I mean, depending on your environment and what you pay attention to, some people might feel a little, or maybe quite a bit hopeless, and others, and I feel like but we attract a certain type of energy based on our perspective and maybe even a proactive perspective at trying to surround yourself with a certain type of people, a certain type of energy, certain information that you consume and things like that. As far as, if some people feel that it's just hopeless and that the world is getting worse instead of better, what can one do? And I know you didn't talk a lot about this, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on what can one do to change their environment to become more hopeful and have more of a positive outlook on the future, maybe amongst all this, oppression and supremacy and all the stuff that we see that the media keeps feeding us.
Yeah. Well, I think there are levels, right? We can do. We work from where we are, and so for some, call it the random acts of kindness, or simple respect and fairness is great. And for others, being a part of an action that to vote, to change policy, to speak up for people, to provide resources, to take food to people who need food, or support in that way. I'm pointing to Oscarin.
Yeah.
And then for others, there's the policy side. But we each can do something. And another plug for the conference is, my hope
put it
for
out
that,
there. Yeah.
It's an online conference, April 16th, 18th, and I want to have spiritual leaders, and I want to have social community activists and students. We already have the students. We need spiritual leaders and community activists to learn about the hidden dynamics and the way that we all take up roles, whether we're conscious of them or not. And then to channel that after doing some of that work into what social action can we collectively identify as doable, and to hold each other kind of accountable in a kind of a coalition. So there's a lot of good work to be done. We're all on this learning.
A lot of good stuff happening all over. You just have to kind of figure out how to plug into it, it seems like, Yeah, because I mean, I met him through a mutual friend, And then I started learning he was all about youth mentorship way back then, healing traumas, similar to what you do. And then COVID hit, and he quickly switched to food distribution, which is just amazing. I love how you're a doer, man. He's right there. You're a doer. Something needs to be done, and he just does it. And as far as like the youth mentorship, we hear that it seems like we hear the term anxiety a lot more than we used to. And you talked about some of these challenges being generational. How far? I guess how far do you think it goes back? How far? Like what kind of problems are we picking up? I mean, I'm picking up my parents' challenges because they kind of I inherited it. I guess you could almost say, and how much of that did they inherit from their grandparents?
Yeah, there's a book called "It Didn't Start with You." I forget the author. He's a therapist, and he just reports on these cases that are really seem mysterious, where people have these like deep fears, anxiety about like being burned alive, or a child who's like constantly banging his head against a wall, and parents can't figure out what's going on, and it turns out that generations past, grandparents or a great grandparent or someone, an uncle, aunt that they never knew, had this lived experience that created that. It was similar to what this other person who had no connection with them was feeling. So it's hard to know how far back and how these things connect. But I mean, we have a long history to reverse. But then there are these groups, 12-step groups, I think, talk about we can interrupt the chain, we can interrupt the pattern from our parents or from our grandparents. Everybody has that potential. So I don't know how long it goes back that we're impacted, but I know that we can transform our own experience. We can
and start moving in a new direction, maybe, or something like that. That's awesome. Now, you talked about using our privileges. Could you give some examples of what kind of privileges certain people have and how they can, say, turn it around and use it as a positive and to make a positive change?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of like YouTube or things on social media where maybe two friends or two relatives, one with much darker pigment, the other lighter, or in a line at a bank or in a store, and one gets treated really well and the other one not, and so the person speaks up, not just the person who's getting the bad end of the deal. So that's one way we can always speak up for people in the moment and figure out the discomfort of that. So my responsibility, I could easily point to all kinds of experiences around race, ethnicity. It's like, this has happened to me and this is wrong. But I have a responsibility with as a male, and I have responsibility as a person with some education, and as a person who is in a system, to speak up and to figure out the discomfort around those things, and certainly to live that. So my wife can tell you how well I lived that.
And I mean, I could talk to you all day about this stuff, I really could. But we do have an audience. I don't know if you guys have any questions, anything that came up that you'd like to comment or anything. I mean, it's a different dynamic that last two times we kind of did it on our own, but now we have you guys here, and I want to see if you guys want to chime in. Oscarin had a big question, I know that.
I did have a question, but I think you touched on it about the high percentage of suicide on white males. Why is that? What's the data telling us?
I don't know enough, to say. I can think of pieces of why that might be. And I guess an example to me that it maybe is linked in some way is the whole oxycodone addiction thing. So that started with, here's this product that's being pushed. People of color, there's this belief that many doctors have continued to hold that can deal with more pain, have a higher pain threshold, or if they get to see a doctor, don't get the same time with the doctor, don't get believed or get sent home with aspirin or something. Whereas the white male, primarily, and others, get like, here, take this pain medication that is totally addictive. And that, becomes a huge problem. So starting with that kind of idea of like some people deserve less and some people deserve more. And then when we internalize that to say, like, why isn't the world going the way I expect it to be? And so, and if I don't have good coping skills to realize that life is not easy or fair, and I don't have people that I can share vulnerability with. I mean, the whole thing about to be male, Mike, I forget the author, he says, to be male means to be afraid of men. Right? We've internalized, you cannot be weak, and so, because men will punish you, right? That's part of our socialization, right? There's all kinds of messed up stuff about being male. And then the white male piece says, like, and you should have more. This is your God-given right. I mean, religion promotes that. I mean, there's a horrible thing about the overlap between evangelicals at this point and white supremacists, or white supremacy in general, the idea of certain people are going to be favored. So that's a lot to be fed, to believe, and then to not have coping skills. And then to have other support where people are actively recruiting and saying, no, you are being wronged, you are the victim here. So there's that piece of it. And I don't know, I know it's got to be a trauma piece linked, meaning that trauma can be things that are real that threaten us, or things that we think are real. And the body reacts the same way, and so people can lose their mind. I mentioned, when somebody's threatened, there's the lizard brain, the mammalian brain, the cortex, the neocortex, and when that fear goes through us, it throws our thinking brain offline, right? And so that's another piece of this. Like when people think and really believe that they're being threatened, there's a neurophysiological response, and it's sad. So I don't know. I'm sure there are more pieces. But that's part of it.
Okay, so the first part of your answer to his question really resonated with me, and is right along the lines of what I wanted to get your reaction on. And Philomena and I were exchanging on there, and I told her what the answer is. He says, well, you should say that. He says, he's saying it. And that is that the white males don't ask for support.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
No, that's part of the stigma, right?
Yeah.
You cannot be reliant on other people.
Yeah.
You are supposed to do it without support.
Yeah.
And that is toxic.
Yeah.
Especially if you're experiencing trauma. To deny yourself any path to connection, well, it would lead to suicide, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That deep disconnect, right? And so in males in general, there's that piece. Yeah. And there's like these, I guess I use more cliches than I want to. The idea of, if you hold up the word illness and wellness and cover up all the letters except for the I and the we, I mean, there's something serious about when we are so isolated, we don't have the endorphins going through us. We don't have the connectors that help us, the serotonin, the dopamine, all these things that are part of being connected. So that's a big deal. That would lead someone to have no other solution. Right?
So the open-ended question that I wanted to ask. First I'll toss out a reference, and you can feel free to weave it in if you actually know the short story. Ursula Le Guin wrote a short story called Those Who Walk Away from Monoliths.
Don't know.
Check it out later. It's at least tangentially related to the theme that I saw weaving through your presentation. As pertains to racism, is that racism creates the up group and the down group, right? So it breaks and denies connection. So racism is a systemic and systematic campaign, approach, attitude to deny connection to the down group. And in the context of suicide among the males, when you do that, of course, you're denying opportunities for connection among those in the up group as well, because they're denying themselves connecting with the down group. And it seems to me that all of the different theme of connection and being connected people is intimately related to racism and what racism is and how to respond to racism. And I thought you might respond to that framing of racism and being connected.
Yeah, I mean, as trauma disconnects, as trauma leads us to get into this fight-flight mode and so on, and then it has consequences. Racism is traumatic. Racism has consequences to people's mental and physical health because we're in that kind of mode of survival. Right? And so there's that ongoing kind of disconnect component that I think is mixed then with, like, if we're going through different stages. And so when I've often been much more difficult to deal with when I was in my rage mode. Right? So I was in assimilation mode when I went to really good schools and when I got degrees. And then when I got more connected to ethnic identity and the history and all this stuff, then this rage was there, and it was, so connect that with someone who, call it a dominant group person, who's just coming into awareness or sensitivity and stuff, and like, that was disconnecting, it was awful. It was important for me to integrate more, and it was maybe important for that person, hopefully, to move forward and develop more of a capacity, I guess, to see that others have got something that to say or experience to share. So I think we're in this like cacophony of connection and disconnection, and I don't know that I think coalitions of interest are a really good way. Relationships are a really good way for people then to kind of hold on to the disconnects, because there is something bigger that connects them. But racism disconnects us in both ways. And so like people will segregate. Beverly Tatum has a book called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" Right? And it's like, well, everybody got along in grade school, and then they went in middle school, and like the black kids are there, and Latino kids are there, and white kids, and because people develop a consciousness that society isn't the same for everybody, and it's a safe place, and not to put others off, but there's that kind of positive connection, but there's a disconnect then with others, right? When people lose those relationships. So it's just a messy process.
Well, I had some thoughts as we were talking about all of this, the connection, disconnect. I feel, and this could be me being racist, it seems to me that white Americans seem to be more individualistic, more, say, career-driven, more, let's not have kids till our finances are in order, or till our careers are good. And if you look at, at least through my experience, Mexican culture, it's more like community-oriented, more, I grew up with aunts and uncles in the same home, and I grew up with, being chastised by my tios and my tias instead of just my parents. And so I don't know how that plays a role, if it's even connected, but it's just this separation of people where I feel like it's healthier when there's more people working together versus what's that saying that it takes a village to raise a child or something like that. I feel like that leads to more of a healthy individual when there's more people involved versus an isolated family, this idealistic, we're gonna go to college, get degrees, get a career, get a nice house, get a nice car, have just one or two kids, and all of our extended families are on their own, and everybody's kind of on their own. I don't know what your thoughts are.
So two things. One is, thanks. Years ago, I wrote and worked with the idea of cultural democracy, right? So there's nothing wrong with somebody having a style, and a plan, and others a style and a plan. There's the clashing that often happens, and we then hopefully figure out how to see the value of both or whatever. But this country is founded very much on individualism, and other groups are much more collectivistic. And I think they both have some value, and I think extreme individualism undermines democracy. So I think that there's a piece of that we all have to examine what's good about the way we've been working and seeing ourselves in the world and what's not so good, and how can we learn from the other. But the other piece I wanted to say is I really appreciate you said maybe I'm racist. Everybody's racist.
Right. We all are.
Everybody's racist.
We all
right?
are. Yeah.
And when I always like roll my eyes, I don't want to when people like, I am not racist, and who is the person? I don't even say his name. I'm the least racist person in the room, in this world. It's like, stop it. Everybody has impacted, is internalized stuff. And there's like, I'm a part of this Latinx study group. It's really beautiful, complex conversations. And we read articles about how within the Latinx community, there's the racism towards the African in us, right? And how do we deal with that, And in the African American community, there's self-hatred about light skin and dark skin. I mean, it's like all these different groups have their own internalized stuff. So everybody's racist. I mean, we're talking about white supremacy because there's some systemic pieces of power that reinforce that. But everybody's got work to do.
Yeah. Well, growing up, I mean, I was the lightest kid in my family, and so there was that where my and I'm both. And just for those that don't know, my mom is Swedish American and my dad is Mexican, and so but my mom was an only child, so I didn't have any cousins, aunts, uncles that were, the same color as me. Everybody else was dark, and so I was I would hear comments like, "Ay, mi güerito, qué guapo, qué." And I'm like, "No, please." I mean, at the time, I thought it was great, But now I'm thinking about like, no, don't, And now I see, from the perspective of a parent, my wife and I have 4 boys, and my wife is from Mexico, and my wife is quite a bit darker than I am, and she will do things. She'll lighten her hair, and she'll want to straighten her hair, and she'll so it's like just like you said, we have these beliefs that if we don't recognize them, they can be detrimental, I think.
And they're reinforced through others, right? We don't just get them ourselves.
And
throughout Latin America, look at who the movie stars are, look at who the announcers are.
Turn on
Look at how the saints. Jesus is white, right? In Latin American countries.
Yeah,
right?
my grandmother. A picture here somewhere.
My grandmother, she's not here anymore, right? But when I was little. So I just say real quickly because. Something that really impressed me later in life. My grandmother would tell me to stay out of the sun when I was little because she didn't want me to get dark like an Indian. Right?
Yeah.
Let me just say my grandmother was blind. She never saw me, but she had internalized that this was what was good for me.
Yeah. No, I mean...
And this is across groups, right? So anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean... And my wife definitely made it clear that being called Indio or India
a huge
was
insult.
Very much an insult, and so but it's very interesting.
I just want to say this is in the context of this larger. It affects everybody.
Yeah,
right? There's some people who think there's something wrong with me and have that rage and have that mistrust for those authorities who are passing that on, and those who are internalizing like, yeah, I am better, and then like. But the world is not telling me I'm better. In fact, they're telling me that I'm a part of this systemic problem, and I can't, So,
So then going back to, say, healing, getting better, making progress, you talked about, participating in groups that are doing things. And you brought up this quote, activism without spirituality is just an angry mob. And I really like that because I feel like society in general has invested a lot in materialism, making life easier, technology, and not so much, I'm not saying it's bad, materialism in general, our health is getting better, technology is getting better. You go to places where people don't really walk anymore. People are driving or they're on a bicycle or whatever, and it's like if we don't invest enough in the spiritual side of things, is there an off balance, and what does that look like, and how can we fix that? Because or maybe I should start with, do you feel that there should be a balance of materialism and spirituality, I guess?
I don't know about balance. I mean, I just think like what what is in service of our purpose. If our purpose is to help others, then maybe materialism isn't the best thing. You know? Definitely, spiritual, to me, spirituality is about connection and integration. And so, what helps us to be connected to ourselves and to others, and to be of service. So again, the privilege piece is, we have privilege, we have things that others don't have. Like, so how do we use that to help others?
Yeah.